In this lesson, we're going to review the key features of the Developer tab and how to use the Record Macro function in Excel. In our previous lessons, we explained that in most cases, we do not need to write the VBA codes by ourselves, and we can use the Record Macro technique to either generate new VBA codes or paste available codes in the VBA module. Microsoft Excel allows users to record a series of steps that they want to automate and then convert it into VBA code, which can be saved as it is or be amended as per their needs. To access the macros and use the Record Macro function as an option, we must follow the following steps. The first step is to save your file as a MacroEnabled workbook. To do this, go to the File tab, then select the Save As option. Under the file name, you'll see a drop-down menu. Select it and then click on the option to save the file as a MacroEnabled workbook. The file is saved as a MacroEnabled workbook so that we can create and run macros and communicate and save the VBA code through Excel. Next, in the second step, you can access the macro option in the Code section of the Developer tab. In most cases, the Developer tab is not automatically activated. To activate it, go to the File, then Options, and then Customize ribbon. On the main tabs list, the Developer tab box will be unchecked. Click it and then press OK. The Developer tab will appear here as shown. Now let's look at some of the features of the Developer tab. The Developer tab is divided into categories that are Code, Addins, Controls, and XML. The most important category for us is the Code, but we'll briefly discuss the other categories as well. The Code category consists of 5 options that are Visual Basic, Macros, Record Macro, Use Relative Reference, and Macro Security. We've already discussed the Visual Basic in our previous lessons, so you can review the details there. The Macros option stores all the macros that are recorded in Excel and lets users run them on any worksheet. We can also access it by pressing the Alt and F8 key at the same time. We will discuss this once we record our first macro. The Record Macro function is used to record the Excel automation tasks that we discussed. In our example, we will record a simple macro for you to understand how the overall process works. When we click on the Record Macro function, it opens up a macro window. It contains 4 options. The first option is to give your macro a unique name. Please ensure that there are no spaces between the words used for the name. However, you can use underscores. The second option is to create a shortcut key for the macro. You can do this so that you can run that macro with the shortcut key. Please note that you can only select limited options. For example, you can't use the Control and B key because it's already used by Excel for the bold text function. The third option asks where the recorded macro is to be saved. By default, it is selected to be saved in the same workbook. However, you can change it to be saved either in some other workbook or a personal macro workbook. The last option is for you to enter a description of the macro. This is extremely useful in times when you have numerous macros and you need to find the relevant macro you'd like to use. The Use Relative Reference option in the Code category is extremely important when recording macros. In this way, the macros are recorded with the actions that are relative to the initially selected cell. We will explain this when we look at our simple example where we record macro both with and without the relative reference option. The Macros Security option opens the Trust Center interface of Excel, which lets the user to select the level and types of security for different macros that Excel contacts with. We will leave these options to the default setting. You can also view these options by accessing the Trust Center by going to the File tab, selecting Options, select Trust Center, and then choose the Macros Security tab. Once you enable the Developer tab, You can also access the option to view macros, record macros, or use the relevant reference directly for the View tab. We will now briefly discuss the other developer tab categories. The Addins category has options to enable different types of add-ins in the Excel. We will not discuss these further, as they will not form part of this macros course. The Controls category will come in handy in later parts of our VBA course. It can be accessed from the VBA interface as well. It contains the Insert option, where we can choose options from Form Controls and ActiveX controls. You can use Form Controls when you want to easily reference and interact with the cell data without using VBA code, and when you want to add controls to chart sheets. For example, after you add a command button to a worksheet and link it to a cell, you can carry out an Excel function linked with the command button, such as running a VBA code. ActiveX controls can be used on worksheet forms with or without the use of VBA code, and on VBA user forms. In general, use ActiveX controls only if the Form Controls option is not enough to fulfill your requirement, and you have a more robust design requirement than those provided by the Form Controls. ActiveX controls have extensive properties that you can use to customize their appearance, behavior, fonts, and other characteristics. The Design mode is activated when you select the Form Controls or ActiveX controls options. Properties open the Properties window of the selected controls, and View Code allows you to edit the code for the controls. These properties include cell width, cell height, font size, font type, font formats, cell alignment, and more. The Run Dialog option runs the custom dialog box. It is used for old dialog sheets that have now been replaced with user forms. To get a general idea, you can right-click on the Sheet tab and click Insert. You'll find some of these old dialogs. We're not going to explain them further in our lessons, as we'll focus on Form Controls and ActiveX controls within this course. The XML category has features such as the ability to view the XML task pane and open the source of XML mapping in the workbook. It also contains expansion packs and XML import options. We don't need to know about it in detail for creating macros. XML is another common type of data file that is used with a parent-child relationship. This is used in database programming to define the primary and foreign source of information to build a relationship between data files. XML is built on the same hierarchical structure of defining the primary source of information, known as source, and where the subsource of information is located, which can be referred to as the child. Now that we know about the different functions of the Developer tab, we can begin with recording our first macro. We're going to use a simple example as we're still in the phase of understanding the overall process of recording and saving the file. We're going to start with a non-macro-enabled workbook so that we can also explain why it's necessary to save it as a macro-enabled workbook. In our example, we have a small data set in columns A and B. We will select these columns and paste it in columns E and F, respectively. In this example, we want to automate the process of copying data in the first two columns and then paste it in columns E and F. We will record two instances of these macros, one with the relative reference and the next without the relative reference. In the first example, we'll go to the record macro and start the recording process. We'll not select the use of the relative reference option. Once the record macro starts, we'll simply select the columns and then paste them as described previously. We'll then click on Stop Recording that appeared in place of Record Macro. Now let's view how the code was generated in the VBA editor. Simply go to the Visual Basic from the Developer tab and click on the Project Explorer. A Project Explorer window will appear on your left. Navigate to Module and then select View Code to view how the code is recorded. The code simply instructs to select columns A and B and then copy it, then select E1 and paste it on the range. Whenever we will run the code on any other data, it'll always copy the same columns and paste it on columns E and F. We can manually edit the code to select different columns or paste it on other cells. In our second example, we'll do the same thing, with the only difference being of selecting the use of relative reference before recording the macro. After recording, we'll review the code and compare it with the one generated without the use of the relative reference. The code where we used relative reference is slightly different from the previous one as it includes the syntax of the active cell. This is because with this option, the macro starts recording relative to the active cell. In our example, it was A1. Even when we pasted the code in column E, it does not give the column name in the formula. Rather, it uses the offset function as a relative to the previous active cell by instructing Excel to move 4 columns forward to reach column E. The mistake that you can make by using the relative reference technique is that after designing the code, selecting the first cell is crucial to run the code smoothly as the rest of the code navigates through the first active cell before running the code. For example, if the code is relative to the cell A1, you have to ensure that the active cell is A1 at all times before running the code on other data files. If it is some other cell, such as C1, the code will not work as intended because it'll always work on columns after 2 steps, as it'll navigate relatively through C1. Now that we have generated both codes, we can save the workbook. We will go to the Save icon and press it. This will give us an error window and prompt us to save the file as a macro-enabled workbook. This is the reason why we always enable the workbook as a macro-enabled workbook if we want to work with macros and VBA. We can try to run these codes on our data again to see whether they were recorded properly and that they work fine. You can see that if we use B1 as the active cell for the macro with the relative reference, the result is not what we wanted because the relative reference moves 1 column forward. We need to make sure that it is A1 before running it. So that completes our lesson here. We hope that you're confident now about how to access macros from the Developer tab. You can now experiment with some different macro options to get the hang of it. Hey guys, thanks for watching this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe from you. And if you want to learn more about Microsoft Excel, check out these videos above. And don't forget to check out our website, commercecurve.com, where we have lots of in-depth finance and accounting courses available with full training workbooks. All of our courses come with complete workbooks of lessons, examples, pre-built financial models, and training video. Hope to see you there.